In the 1990s, more than 1 million people tuned into court TV to watch the trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez. The brothers were eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. More than 3 decades later, there is renewed attention on the case after 2 recent documentaries and a scripted Netflix series introduced the brothers to a new generation of true crime enthusiasts. This fall, the Los Angeles District Attorney recommended that the Menendez brothers be resentenced. The popularity of this type of content is creating a real-life impact for accused perpetrators, victims, and their families. But what are the ethical and practical limitations of true crime?
What bounds the genre for me is that you have non-fictional accounts of crime, usually violent crime, but not always, that has some element of entertainment value. They can still take it very seriously, but this element that this is also, that there's some component of entertainment to it, that it's a consumable and that people enjoy it.
That's Whitney Phillips, Assistant Professor of Digital Platforms and Ethics at the University of Oregon. According to a recent report from Edison Research, 84% of Americans over the age of 13 consume true crime content. This fascination isn't necessarily new. Think of the so-called penny press newspapers that ran sensationalized and gruesome stories throughout the mid-1800s. Today, of course, the format has shifted. Consumers are getting the true crime fix through podcasts, streaming platforms, and even social media sites like TikTok. Clearly, Phillips was right when she said it has entertainment value. But what exactly do people find appealing about these types of stories?
In some of the research that's been done around true crime, you see a very strong gendered component, that the primary audience for true crime media, it's women. And there are some theories about why that might be. And one of them is it's a way to develop skills, a skill set in case something bad were to happen to you, then how might you respond? And so there are these different kinds of psychological reasons that people engage. And then there are also pure entertainment reasons. People like a whodunit. They like to try to solve a problem or a mystery, especially if the story plays out on social media, that you can participate, you can be a sleuth yourself, you can engage. Can be very collaborative.
With the popularity of books, TV shows, and podcasts about true crime, it can be easy to forget that they are true stories about real people. For example, while the Menendez brothers may benefit from a fresh look at their case, they were not happy with the way they were portrayed in the media. They said in a statement that the recent Netflix series about them was full of, quote, blatant lies. The Menendez brothers are not the only subject of true crime media to be negatively affected by the content. According to Renee Williams, CEO at the National Center for Victims of Crime, it can leave many victims and families re-traumatized.
I think especially when the victims aren't included in the actual content creation is when you're going to see the most trauma. And really, it's that we are re-traumatizing individuals that have lived through this. We got a phone call from a woman whose mother was pretty brutally murdered in the 80s, and they decided to do a show on it and did not reach out to her or her brother. And she saw on a TV commercial photos of her mother's bloodied body that she had never seen before. The producers of that show had reached out to the police department and to the prosecutors and had interviewed them, but they had not gotten permission from the victims. And so it's reminding people that because there's a victim, that victim has family. That victim has people who care very deeply about them. If they're still living, that victim also has feelings, and they did not choose to become public figures.
In addition to stirring up traumatizing experiences from years ago, true crime can interfere with ongoing criminal investigations. After 4 college students were killed in Idaho in 2022, amateur sleuths took to social media to investigate. Phillips explains that the public frenzy around the case led to an onslaught of false accusations and theories that made the situation harder for the real detectives.
Law enforcement, in the wake of the Idaho killings, repeatedly, publicly talked about how damaging and distracting the public involvement could be. And it's this fine line because on one hand, for decades, police have relied on tips and information from the public to try to pursue their cases. But it really crosses a line when everyday people who don't have specialized training and don't have experience in law enforcement or any forensic techniques assume that they are also detectives, and they're not. And when you're talking about online sleuthing, folks can really have their heart in the right place and can really want to try to help, but that can slow investigations down. It can kick up red herrings. It can subject totally innocent bystanders who aren't even connected to the case, except maybe they share the same last name, to all kinds of unwanted attention that does not make law enforcement's job any easier.
Both Phillips and Williams agree that true crime content tends to focus more on certain kinds of victims and stories while ignoring others. For example, in the U.S., Indigenous women are 3 times more likely to experience violence compared to other women. That's according to the Justice Department. However, as Phillips explains, these stories receive little attention in true crime media.
True crime media historically has been very white, and it often features very similar kinds of stories. There are certain kinds of victims that are regarded as more marketable, that appeal to audiences in these very patterned ways. And what that creates is, for one thing, a false picture of who faces violence and whose lives and whose deaths ultimately matter and are worth storytelling. And so one potential argument that you could make as to where true crime could contribute something positive, those media that push back against the white centrality of the quote unquote perfect victim.
Even with its flaws, true crime can contribute something positive. When done right, as Williams explains, this content can aid in solving crimes and give victims a platform to share their stories.
I think there are absolutely positive impacts, and that's one of our organization's big sticking points. Is we're not saying that this has to go away. We're not saying this is all bad. There are absolutely positive points. First of all, if you can harness media and become a true crime intrigue case, you can get a lot of attention on your case. If somebody is still missing, you have tons more eyes watching for folks and being involved in helping solve the crime or find the person. And for those that we see where the person is deceased or the thing has already happened, a lot of times there's healing for the family members in getting their loved one's story out or telling who their loved one was.
So when is true crime helpful and when is it harmful? To make this distinction, the National Center for Victims of Crime created several rules for being an ethical true crime consumer. By following these guidelines, Williams says fans of this type of media can keep their hobby while also respecting victims and their families.
There is no victimless true crime, and that is our golden rule. And that's the idea that there will always be a victim and family members if you're watching interesting true crime. And so remember that, and remember they're real people who did not put their hands up to be public figures. The second rule is there's no timeline for trauma. And that means that stories about serial killers from the 1970s still greatly impact the families of those serial killers' victims. And it doesn't make it hurt any less. And having stories told in a public and romanticized way is both dangerous and very traumatic to those victims. The biggest one for us is require the presence of victims' voices. We see this all the time. Shows will interview police officers, they'll interview district attorneys, they'll interview neighbors. And I think people think in their heads that means that they have the victim's approval to be pushing a story out. That's not necessarily true. And so find out if the victims or their family were contacted before making the documentary, before being discussed. And if they were, what was their reaction?
Williams also encourages consumers to be intentional with the media they watch and to avoid causing further harm to victims whenever possible. Above all, she urges people to turn their interest into impact by donating or volunteering for organizations that advocate on behalf of victims. Phillips agrees and says with some parameters, true crime aficionados can use their fascination for good.
There are better ways to tell these stories, and there are worse ways to tell these stories. And the most ethically conscientious ways to storytell in this way, you're talking to the family, you're making sure that you're centering the victim's life as a totality and not reducing them just to their final horrible minutes.
To find out more about Whitney Phillips, Renee Williams, and all our featured guests, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, check out Viewpoints Radio on X, Facebook, and Instagram. This segment was written and produced by Grace Galante. Our lead producer is Libby Foster. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price. This segment is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Since 2013, the annual Progressive Keys to Progress event has provided deserving veterans with vehicles, helping our heroes drive their lives forward. Learn more about this program at keystoprogressive.com.